I agree, but what I'm saying is we're opening up the kinds of things we consider when we attempt to give explanations. We're not just looking, like in a Humean fashion, for relations between events. We're also looking for constraints on what's possible, because we now long. So what I'm arguing for is you can't be a nominalist about possibility anymore. You can't say possibility is just something we humans do because of lack of knowledge. Possibility has to be real. The constraints have to be real, because you have to be able to, if they're not, I mean, this is I think this is part of an implication of Mike's argument. Like there seems to be a real ordering and a real, I'm struggling for a word, a real existence in order to explain the radical novelty that there hasn't been some long historical process. You can't give a causal history for this, right? But nevertheless, it's playing a fundamental role. Mike, maybe I'm misrepresenting you, but please.
Yeah, really interesting question. So three things I'd like to say. First, about the views of Plato and Whitehead and all of that. None of what I do is meant to stick closely to what any of these people thought, to whatever extent we know what they thought. And I thought about this really hard, about the naming of this, and I may at some point need to change the name. The reason I went with Platonic space is because it tied what I'm saying to a body of work among mathematicians where they know exactly what I'm talking about. That is really it. Other things that Plato may have thought about, unchanging forms and all that, I don't really, go along with. And so, within none of these things am I trying to stick close to any of that, right? And so we can talk about how much of this I think is right or whatever. The second thing I wanted to say is in terms of constraints. So here's my thought on this. The kinds of things that are constrained by these forms, I think these are the things we generally call physics. In other words, why do the fermions do X, Y, Z? Oh, it's because this mathematical structure has a symmetry that only allows that's the constraints. What I think happens in biology, there are some constraints, but I think it's much more than that. I think the things we call life and that we call biology are things that exploit and are potentiated by those forms, not just constrained by them. So the big thing, and we can talk about how I think biology exploits the hell out of a lot of free lunches that are provided by these forms, so that it is no longer enough. If you're just talking about constraints, you're talking about the low end of my spectrum, which is machines and the kinds of things physics likes to study. By the time you get to the things biology likes to study, what you're finding is that these forms are not just constraining what happens; they're actually potentiating or greatly enhancing what can happen. Right.
I get that, Mike. But there's a problem here, because they don't prototypically have the defining features of causal events. They don't have a definitive location or time, right? And so talking about them as if they're causes is also equally problematic.
So let's talk about this. This is really good, and I'm interested to see what you have to say about this. Chris Field said the same thing to me once, that it's really hard to think about these things as causes, because causes are supposed to precede effects, for example. And if there's I don't know how to add a time component to this, to the Platonic space, at least yet. I agree. But I do think they're causal. And I'll tell you how. I'm using a slightly different emphasis for causation. I'm using the following, and I don't know who exactly this is due to, but it goes like this. You have two features, and you want to know which one causes which one. What you do is you tweak this one, and you see if this changes, and then you tweak this one, and you see if this one changes. And the driver, right? So what I'm looking for is to find out which one is the driver of the other one. And that's the causation. The causation is when if I change thing A and thing B inevitably follow suit, then I can say that A is causal to B. What to do with time, I don't claim to know, but I'm interested in the functional causation. And so
in terms of time, it's not that complicated, because purposes are causes, and you can't measure the purpose until you've reached the goal. And so the cause appears at the end in many systems, because the purpose is drawing things into it, and then you only see its result once you've reached there. It's like when you watch a movie and let's say you watch Sixth Sense, and you don't understand what's happening, and then at the end it reveals to you what all of these things were doing, and once you see it, it becomes the cause of the movie. but it's not a cause like a billiard ball hitting another. It's a formal cause. It's a cause that is explaining the reason why all of these things are together in the first place.
Yeah, I get it, and I agree. And
Mike, the person is J.S. Mill. It's called the Method of Differences.
Fantastic. Okay.
J.S. Mill. Yeah.
Super. I didn't know that. Okay, that's great. So here's the kind of thing I have in mind for the causation bit. This is just one of a million examples we could talk about. The cicadas come out at 13 years and 17 years. So you're a biologist and you ask, well, so why is that? And then you say, well, it's because they're trying to time their, make sure that their predators don't time the cycles, right? Because if it was 12 years, then every 2 years, every 3 years, every 4 years, somebody would be. And so you say, oh, that's amazing. So what is it about 13 and 17? And you say, these are prime. Okay, and so why specifically 13 and 17? And so now what's happened is you've left the realm of biology, you've left the realm of physics, now you're in the math department. And they can explain to you why the distribution of primes is the way it is. And so now we have this situation where if the distribution of primes had been different, the cicadas would be coming out at a different time. But on the other hand, there is nothing I can do in biology and physics. I can tweak the constants of the Big Bang. Whatever I want to do at the physical world, I am never going to change the distribution of primes or the value of E or Feigenbaum's constant. So what I see as causation is simply this. I see that the patterns are determining aspects of the physical world. And I don't see any way for things we do in the physical world to feed back. Although there is there's a caveat to this, but that is what I see as the causation. That the influence flows in that if we want to understand what's happening here, the source is in these facts of mathematics and in facts of other things that are not mathematics. So that I think are actually psychology or whatever they are.
So I agree with you that there are determination relations. I guess I'm pressing on this because one of the classic problems, I mean, this is a standard trope in the philosophy of mathematics for Platonism, is accounting for the causal status. You can't seem to get any causal relation out of these things because they don't seem to bear a temporal or spatial location. Like, where is any of those functions where are they? Like, are they over there? They're nowhere, and then they're everywhere. And they don't happen at a specific time or a specific place. And so I think I hear what you're saying, and this is why I want to press you, Mike, because I think something's happening. Let's take up your proposal because it's a really good one. Let's reserve constraint for something where we're just talking about. No, we have to give them their due. By the way, there's not only selective constraints; there are enabling constraints. So it's not just this. So, but you said it's more than that. I get there's a sense of almost an exploratory element to this. Is that fair?
Yes,
okay, so
fair.
Constraint does not convey that. But, classically, cause doesn't either, and the stuff you're talking about doesn't have a lot of the other features of cause. It sounds to me almost like, and Dennis Walsh is trying to do the same thing here, he's a philosopher of biology at the University of Toronto, is to come up with, that there is something other than what we mean by cause or constraints that we're talking about here, and this is why I try to invoke the I think I mentioned it to you, the Neoplatonic notion of a paradigmatic cause, which is not a formal cause, an efficient cause, a mechanical cause, or a final cause. It's this accessing and downloading vertical kind of determination.
Yeah.
I
like that a lot, and I agree with you in the sense that if the standard version of causation doesn't capture what's going on here, too bad for the standard version of causation. I agree. Okay, it doesn't have a location. It doesn't have too bad. Who cares? I think there's something much more important going on here. I think those kind of causes were worked out largely by people focused on building steam engines and things, where this knob is over here touching this thing and the gear, and this is why. That kind of causation is not going to do us in the biological and the cognitive sciences. I don't think. And in fact, I make the connection to there was another case where this came up, which is when Descartes sort of announced this idea of a non-physical mind running the brain around like a puppet. The Princess of Bohemia, I forget her name, wrote to him and said, "Well, look here, how that you said the non-physical mind doesn't have a location, and we have conservation of mass. How is that going to happen?" And what I find really weird, and I've been playing with this stupid idea of writing some sort of a fictional dialogue between the two of them that I think should have happened if it didn't happen, because Descartes was a mathematician. What it seems to me he should have said is, "Excuse me, we have had since the time of Pythagoras and before that, we have already had examples of non-physical facts determining reality in the physical world. We've already had this."
He does, yeah, but and your question is a good one. Why doesn't he? Because he gets committed to a completely horizontal notion of causation.
Yeah.
He gets committed to, and because there is the rejection of any verticality to ontology, there's deeper ontological moves that are going on that precludes him from considering. You're right. That answer should have been available to him, but he's rejecting any kind of Platonic verticality. And what I see you doing, and I think we're actually fleshing it out. That was an unintended pun. We're fleshing it out is like. The strong need to bring a verticality back into our ontology in a deep way.
Yeah, and specifically, I mean, the kind of just to be clear, I'm not a philosopher. The reason that I prefer this kind of version is driven by engineering. It's driven by the following. The cause, when I'm looking for causes, I'm not looking for, to match any philosophical notion of causation. What I want as an engineer is, where should I be looking in order to understand and control the system that I want to understand and control? And if the traditional notion of causation doesn't help me do that, then fine. Then I'm not interested. What I want to understand is if I have a system that behaves in a certain way, whether it's cicadas that come out at 13 years, or whether it's a Xenobot that does things that we didn't ask it to do, or a bubble sort that has side quests that are not in the algorithm, or these kinds of things that we study. If the answer lies in in the properties of mathematical objects, then as far as I'm concerned, that's the cause I'm looking at. If somebody wants to come up with a different terminology for it, fine. But as an engineer, this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking to understand what is actually driving the thing that I'm interested in.
And I think you're completely epistemically virtuous. I'm not making anything. Although I do think good philosophical argument matters too.
Sure.
But what I'm saying is, you're basically you're following the science, and I mean that in a good way, not the way that phrase has been used in the past, the recent past, but you're following the science and is basically leading us out of a framework that was given to us, a fundamental ontological, epistemological framework given to us by the Enlightenment, the framework called modernity, where we understand reality, we understand causation this way, there's no vertical, et cetera, and this, like, I see you. Tell me if this is wrong, but the science, you're following the science, and it's leading us out of that framework. And I'm trying to point out how profound I think that is.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I agree with you. I think we made certain assumptions around, and again, I'm not a historian of science, but my understanding of what happened during the Enlightenment is that we made certain assumptions about the sets of tools we were going to use.
Yes.
Like every set of tools, it has blind spots. We are still sort of coasting along on those tools, assuming that turn the crank long enough and things will be okay. I think we've gone way beyond now understanding that a lot of these assumptions were not good. They were fine at the time. They served us well for some time, but they're not actually going to keep going. And there's something else I wanted to mention, which is this notion of embodiment. So
yes.
The part that people tend to agree with me on is the part that I think embodiment is absolutely critical. It's very important. The part where I tend to lose everyone is the following. I think as human beings with a very particular the cognitive apparatus and evolutionary history and whatever, I think we are obsessed with the three-dimensional world. I think that there are spaces in which kinds of minds, meaning beings, and some of them are morally important beings, do this perception, decision, action loop, right? The world in which they strive, they solve problems, they suffer, they win, they lose, they do things. I think there are numerous spaces that are very difficult for us to visualize as humans. And because we have trouble visualizing these spaces, we assume that they don't exist. And when we say embodiment, we mean, a physical body. If you're a software agent, you need to have a robot and trundle around on wheels or now walk around or something. You can't just be sitting in a box somewhere. You don't engage with the physical world unless you're, running around touching things. Well, biology, long before nerve and muscle evolved, biology was doing all of these kinds of problem-solving, navigational, goal-directed things in physiological state space, in transcriptional state space, in metabolic state space, in anatomical. This is what we study in our lab mostly, is anatomical state space. These spaces are as real to these beings that live in those spaces, I think, as the three-dimensional world is to us. They are as fictional and as constructed as the 3D world is by us, I think. And they are real and also constructed to the same degree. And there are many different kinds of embodiment that we do not traditionally recognize as embodiment. And there's actually a good chunk of my lab now is devoted to creating tools, empirical tools, for people to use to recognize beings in non-traditional spaces and to communicate with them. This is one of our goals, is to enable you to recognize, communicate with, and ethically relate to beings that live in all kinds of other crazy spaces that we don't, we can't visualize. So I just want to be really clear that to me, it's not that, okay, there are forms and then there's like 3D universe. There are many other spaces as far as I'm concerned.
Jonathan, before you say it, I just want one more point of conversion. Dan Chiappia and I did a lot of work about the NASA scientists moving the rovers around on Mars. And does that violate embodiment? Because the scientists are here and the rovers are up there. And what we found was, no, there's a different way in which they collectively organize themselves and make use of the information from the rovers to create this overall dynamical system that has the capacity to grok hyper patterns that like individual human cognition can't grasp. Now, we argued that was a kind of embodiment, even though it's not a physiological body. And we were trying to understand embodiment as, are you adaptively coupled to your environment in a way that makes a difference to your ability to solve problems in that environment, or something like that. But again, very convergent. What was interesting, and this is where my work overlaps with Jonathan, and then I'll shut up so Jonathan can talk, is the kinds of things that the scientists had to do in order to participate in that collective intelligence, in order to make it a sensed presence. They had to do all this imaginal weird. They had to identify with the rover. They had to internalize it. They had to do all this stuff, and I'm being a little bit provocative here, but it looks very similar to a lot of the stuff people have typically done in religious settings. They do imaginal things. They extend identity. They internalize, like the saint. And frankly, the scientists got kind of religious about the rovers. They really did. They started to talk as if they had like a sympathetic magic connection to them. These are these hard-headed scientists. But if you do the actual ethnography, that's obviously not what they publish. But if you go and do the ethnography of how they're doing the work, it's really messy like that. And so I put a fly in the ointment, but now I'm putting a flower in the ointment as the potential point. Like, yeah, we talk about this, but there's the question about I think it's very plausible that human beings can participate in these collective intelligences in some way or form. And given Eric Hol's work, that gives us access to otherwise inaccessible causal power and information access that's otherwise not available. I'm not invoking anything woo here. You and I know Eric Hol's got some pretty rigorous argument and some good simulations providing evidence for this. But for me, if we got a verticality and we have that kind of participation, and it seems to be actually allowing, and I'm using your language, Mike, the engineering to move the rovers around and be able to study the hyper objects, the hyper patterns of the Martian atmosphere, then there's the possibility that maybe stuff we had dismissed as being in the Enlightenment as being superstitious, we should take seriously again. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan, because that's my flower in the ointment, right?
Well, just very quickly, I like that a lot, and I can tell you that something very similar, I think, is the future of molecular medicine, because what we are doing right now is pointing out that if you have a bowling ball on a landscape, then your view as a third-person external observer tells pretty much the whole story. You can see, you know what's going to happen. But if you have a mouse on a landscape, your view as an external observer is kind of useless. You need to know, what does the mouse think of this landscape, what does he see, and where. So now when we look at, okay, we want to control the physiology of the liver, or we want to control the blastema to regenerate a limb or an eye or whatever, which of those models is going to do? And I'm here to tell you that it's not the bowling ball model. It's the first person perspective model. So that in the future, when you are going to and we're trying to make tools for this, we're trying to make practical tools for this. Instead of controlling the rover in 3-dimensional space on Mars, you are controlling as a worker in regenerative medicine, you are controlling the movement of cells in an invisible anatomical morphospace that you can't see, or the movement of your liver in physiological state space that has 29 dimensions that you couldn't begin to imagine. And so you need tools for you to become that being, to share your inner perspective with it and say, okay, I'm kind of, again, like, right, I'm not trying to get woo here, but I think there will be tools, there will be augmented reality tools that will say, I want you to navigate the space thus. How are you going to do that if you don't understand the space? How are you going to communicate to this being if you're not part of it in the same way that you were talking about merging with that rover, right? Yeah. And I think we're going to end up in a lot of very weird spaces that are at different scales, different time scales, spatial scales, distributed, disconnected, where we are going to be part of that first-person perspective of really weird beings like body organs, like cells, like synthetic self-growing houses and God knows what, that we are going to have to be part of that. From the inside, not from the outside.
There's a lot has been said, but for sure, in terms of the idea of non-3D bodies, I think people have known about these for a long time. We call them subtle bodies. There are different iterations of it. Of course, most ancient traditions care mostly about those that are at the personal and transpersonal level, but you can find embodiments, for example, at a personal influence level in stories. That is, the way that I influence others through even just speech is that type of non-completely physical embodiment. If a very influential celebrity endorses a product, and then that gets taken up in the minds of parents that then buy that product for children, what you're encountering is a non-physical pattern that's embodying itself at different levels and is kind of reaching all the way down. And so in the human sphere and in the kind of social sphere, we have these types of bodies that they're all different types of bodies that are not completely gross, like that aren't brute, but we're used to understanding how influence functions, and I don't know if you've thought about the analogy between those types of influences, like the way that you could say the way that music makes people dance, and the types of things that you're doing, because in music obviously music is a auditory pattern. It's not a brute thing that rams into each other, but nonetheless, what it does is that it embodies itself first in just vibrations of sound, and then it slowly moves down until it manifests itself in a bunch of people square dancing, on the floor. And so I don't know if there are analogies that you can see between those types of transpersonal patterns kind of embodying themselves and what it is you're doing at the biological level.
Yeah. There's a lot going on there, and one person that you guys probably should talk to is Richard Watson. So, University of Southampton. So he's a computer scientist, evolutionary biologist, and he and I have done a bunch of work together. He's very interested in metaphors of music and things like this, in driving collective intelligence and these spaces and all the everything you just said. Like, you guys could talk for hours with him. So I would suggest that as well.
That's interesting because, that first of all, that for me, I've been doing Taoist practices for 30 years, and I really have objected to the very North American way of talking about this in terms of energy and stuff like that. In situ, the metaphor that's used for the Tao are almost always musical metaphors, not energetic metaphors, and it's much more aligned with that. I very much. Mike, could you link?
I'll make a connection now. Let me just,
Thank you.
So the biggest question though that comes to my mind is that I mean, I want to make sure I understand correctly. If I'm not understanding correctly, please do correct me. And so what you seem to be talking about, it connects to this idea that in some ways these patterns that are framing or that are, gathering this potential together towards purposes, and that these are these bioelectrical patterns that are manifesting themselves that way, but that ultimately they represent certain purposes or certain goals that this multiplicity now organizes itself towards. If that's right, then it seems that there is, I believe, at least most traditions in the history of the world have ascertained that there's a hierarchy of those goals, that there is a natural hierarchy of the goods through which these patterns manifest into the world. And in that way, that's why in some ways the classical Darwinian system is almost easier to understand in that sense, which is, if it survives, then it's closer. It's closer to the good in some ways. That there's a goodness calling. There's something that makes being persist, and through iterations, that maintains itself, and things get thrown off, things get brought back. Like there's all this back and forth. But in the space that you are able to enter now, and like in some ways by bringing human agency into these systems. Let me just frame this with one last statement, which is that at least at the human level, because of human consciousness and especially human self-consciousness, we have recognized that in the way that we act, that there are certain patterns that are parasitic. There are certain wills that you can download, that you can interact with, that you can be influenced by, that are actually destructive, but that we do so nonetheless for all kinds of perverse reasons, which I don't want to go into too much. And so when I hear you talk about, like, we could do anything, right? We could you could grow wings, you could grow 5 eyes, you could do all these things. I also am worried of the fall, right? Worried of us bringing our parasitic processes into a space which until now has in some ways hasn't been completely tainted by it. Of course, it is tainted to some extent. I mean, we do species breeding. These are slow versions of imbibing patterns into species. And now you're doing it at like one generation. You create a chimera. And the reason why we have warnings about chimeras in mythology is not completely, I think, irrelevant, right? That we have this image of the Sphinx that will eat you.
Well, there's many things that are not chimeras that will eat you. So, I guess okay. So you brought up two things. I'd like to talk about both of them. Let's do the first one first. So the patterns that we pick up. So I want to float an idea, roughly summarized in this idea of thoughts are thinkers. And which is this. Let's visualize this idea that there are many patterns of one way to do the hierarchy, and I don't know what kind of hierarchy this space has, but I'm open to that, and I can see there's one hierarchy that I can see immediately, which is